Hey, Jesus Hacks. I am joined here today with Jeff Goins, author of the new book, The Art of Work. And I'm so glad that we could just sit down and meet with you, Jeff, if you want to introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Neil. Great to be with you. I'm an author, and I for the longest time wouldn't call myself a writer, and over the past few years realized that this was my calling. This was the thing that I was meant to do, and it's been fun to share this message in the art of work with other people and help them, discover their own God-given callings.
Yeah, man. So let's just dig in here. Um, we're talking about calling with the art of work. And calling is such a vague word in our culture today. You know, some people, they believe it exists, others don't believe it exists, they treat it like a myth.
Yeah.
But I believe people really don't know how to describe what a calling is. So tell me, Jeff, how would you define calling, or how did you define it in your book?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that I love that word calling, and I think that more and more we're hearing people think and talk about the work that they want to do in these terms, not just as a means of making a living, but also as a means of making a meaningful life. And I think a calling is a way to do that. I think quite simply, a calling, wherever you think it comes from, I happen to think it comes from God. But I hear people using this term, in our culture all the time with different ideas of, where it comes from. I think a calling really is the reason that you were born. It's, as one of my friends once said, it's that thing that you can't not do, the thing that you're compelled to do. Frederick Buechner said your calling, your vocation, is the place where your deepest joy meets the world's deepest need.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of those together, hopefully are an adequate definition for calling.
Exactly. I love that description of what you were born to do. And
Yeah.
just to take it on a personal level for here, I feel like in reading your book, you were saying listen to your life, and I was really reflecting on my life, and a lot of my life was this struggle with pride
Mm.
and being selfless with my life. I was very, very self centered, and a lot of that was because of different influences in my life. And as I'm now looking back on my life, I'm seeing that what I'm doing with Jesus Hacks, it makes sense with my calling, with
Mm.
that direction. So I appreciate you defining it in that way. So at Jesus Hacks, we're all about selfless living. And as I read your book, I couldn't help but notice how living out your calling, it leads to the selfless life. And you alluded to that in your book. You talk about
Mhm.
connecting with the needs of the world and living for a larger purpose. So, could you clarify what that larger purpose is? Or, in other words, let me restate the question. How does living out your calling relate to being selfless with our lives?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I love that you're championing that.
Yeah.
Jackie Robinson said that a life is not significant except for its impact on others,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's absolutely true. I think that the thing that I'm afraid of, because I'm an ambitious person and can sometimes go after something, thinking that life is all about me and success is all about getting the things that I want. I think I'm most afraid of getting to the end of my life and realizing that I lived my life mostly for myself as opposed to living for others and missing opportunities to bring others along for the journey. So I'm aware of that because there are these times when I reach a goal or get something that I think I want and I've been selfish about it. I don't have anybody to celebrate with, and it's not fun. It's not exciting.
Yeah, I
Uh,
know that.
Victor Victor Frankl talks about this in Man's Search for Meaning. He says that if you're going to have a meaningful life, you need to have three things. You need to have a project to work on, some sort of meaningful work to do. That can be a side project, or it could be your day job. It can be whatever. You need to have someone to love and someone who loves you. That can be a pet, or it could be a spouse, or a friend. And then lastly, you have to have a redemptive view of your suffering. You have to be willing to see all the bad things in your life and find good in them, or see good that's come from them, and be able to forgive your enemies, let go of bitterness, all of that. So when it comes to finding our purpose, if you follow that that kind of three-part structure that Frankl prescribes, being selfless is a necessary part of it. You know, I think that a lot of people in our culture talk about pursuing your passion or finding your bliss, and I think that trying to be happy is the worst way to be happy. As Viktor Frankl says that,
Yep.
you know, like you're not happy, you don't have a meaningful life until you're sharing your life with somebody else, you're doing something meaningful, and you're seeing all the, you know, terrible bad things that happen in the world or happen to you. You know, you're trying to find some good to come from them. So you know, if we want to be happy, the worst thing that we can do is just try to please ourselves. It's actually a pretty empty way to live life.
Wow. Yeah. I love Man's Search for Meaning, and I read it over and over again, and so I know exactly what you're talking about. Um, Great. So, moving on. Why do you think this message of calling is important for the millennial and upcoming generation? Do you believe that we have to be more entrepreneurial in the future? Talk about that.
Yeah, so you know, as I mentioned before, I hear more and more people talking about calling, you know, their vocation, the work that they do,
Mm-hmm.
in these terms of purpose. Like I don't, you know, I am wanting to do something that I'm not getting to do, and I feel like the work that I do has no deeper meaning or purpose. I just when people complain about their jobs, these are the things that I most often hear, much more often than, oh, I'm not making enough money or I don't get enough vacation time. We understand intuitively now that work is something that ought to be a satisfying experience that also, you know, creates, you know, meaningful products or services, you know, that we're creating meaning in the world through the work that we do. And if we're not doing that, we feel like we're missing out on something. So, you know, what does that mean in terms of being entrepreneurial? Well, one of the things I talk about in the book is that your calling is not just one thing. That's kind of a myth that you hear a lot of people say. Oh, like I have lots of interests. I have lots of passions. Well, your calling isn't one thing. It's a few things. It's a portfolio
Exactly.
of skills and you know, needs that the world has and passions that you have, and combining them in an interesting portfolio that you can share with people. So, you know, as I was kind of exploring this, talking to people, hearing their stories about how they did multiple things and they all kind of comprised the calling, their purpose. Without one aspect, they could have been doing something else. When I was going through this, I saw that there was a study that came out recently that was published in Forbes, where
Mm-hmm.
they predicted that by the year 2020, over half of the American workforce is going to be freelance, which is kind of
Wow.
interesting. I mean, you know, I was raised with this idea that, you know, you go to school, you get a good job, and you work that job for, you know, 20, 30, maybe 40 years, and then you retire and really do what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not possible anymore. It's much more rare than it used to be. Organizations aren't around for decades anymore. They're around for a few years, and then they, you know, go under or they get sold or acquired. And people are valuing their freedom and independence more, and they're not just wanting to work one job for the rest of their lives. And I think this is good news. I think most of us are wired not to just do one thing, but to do a few things and to do them well. And
Yep.
so, what's interesting about that question is whether you consider yourself entrepreneurial or not. If you are in the workforce in the next 5 years, this idea of living what Charles Handy calls a portfolio life, not just having one thing that you do for a living, but a few things that you do for a living.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be thrust upon you. You know, it's gonna be the majority for most of us in the workforce in our lifetime in the next few years. So, you know, one of the things that I tried to do in the art of work was encourage people to be thinking about those things now. This is going to be the way we live our lives very soon, and I think it's a good thing. I think it means that you're not just one thing. You're not a robot that does one thing over and over and over again on an assembly line until you die. You've got a lot of different interests, and the world is making room, and the workforce is making room for people to take those interests and combine them in interesting ways where you can create your own portfolio career.
Wow. I love that response. I read a stat the other day that said like 61% of my generation wants to be making a difference in the world and
Yeah,
connects that with the idea of work. But then
yeah,
also 54% of my generation would take a massive pay cut in order to do that.
yeah. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So we're definitely becoming more entrepreneurial.
Mm.
Um, so I want to talk about the process in writing the book. As I heard, you wrote the book and then you scrapped it to include
Yeah.
more stories of others. So
Right.
tell me about that decision. Why did you decide utilizing people's stories was the best way to approach this topic of calling?
Well, so I just connect with stories more. So I wrote
Yeah.
this book, and it was really didactic, and
Mhm.
it was, hey, do these things. And, at 32 years old, I've learned some things, but I don't have everything figured out. And I thought it was a little disingenuous for me to say, hey, here's how you in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, this is how you need to approach the work that you do. So I went in search of other people's stories to try to include them in the book. And then when I started encountering these stories, they were so gripping and so interesting, and I learned things. I mean, I thought your calling was one thing, and I learned it was a few things. I thought that you just knew what you were supposed to do, and I learned that it's actually a discovery process that takes time and action. So interviewing these people changed the way I thought about this topic, so much so that I felt like I need to not be the main voice in this book. These people's voices, their stories, this needs to be the main voice in the book. And it was fun. It was fun to write that book that way, and I think it was the right choice. People who read the book tell me, "Man, I connect with so and so stories, or I like that story." And it's just when you've got a bunch of different stories, there are different entry points and ways to act people. And it was fun to do it that way, and it was fun for me to share some of these stories that I encountered that I thought were incredibly inspiring and interesting, but at the same time were ordinary enough that like you could connect with them. You go, oh, like this person seems like a normal person, and yet they're doing something really extraordinary with their life. That was the idea. I wanted to take ordinary stories and inspire people to do something extraordinary with their everyday lives.
That's that's great because you know I'm writing my book now about designing the selfless life, and I'm doing
Yeah,
the same thing. I'm bringing in stories of other people, and I felt like that honored the topic of selfless life. And in the same
yeah,
way, I think
exactly.
bringing in people's stories really honors the topic of a calling, because then you don't sound like you're some wise guru who's done it
Yeah,
all, learned it all.
right. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so I really appreciate that. I definitely connected with a lot of the people's stories. So
Cool.
moving on, uh, in the author's note of the book, you say you needed to write this book. And after following your stuff, I've been following your stuff for years on Goins Writer. It's been excellent for my
Thanks.
journey as a writer. But in following
Cool.
your stuff for quite a while now, I agree. You needed to write this book. But describe that in your own terms. Why did you write this book, and why did you feel you needed to write it?
So one of the things I say in that author's note, because I think if I didn't do that, the reader, at least the reader that would be familiar with my work, might
Mm-hmm.
be sort of thrown off by the different style of the book. And I said that this wasn't the book I intended to write. This was the book I was supposed to write, and
Yeah.
and I think that honors the topic of calling. The basic argument in the art of work is your life's work, the thing that you're meant to do, is not necessarily the thing that you plan to do. It's the thing that you end up doing, the thing that you're supposed to do. And the way that you get there is through this kind of mysterious but practical process of listening to your life, pivoting along the way, and then ultimately realizing that it's not about you, and that a calling is more about the thing that you leave behind than the work that you do. And that was a process. Learning those lessons was a process that surprised me. And the whole journey of writing a book was also something that surprised me. The discoveries that I made, and I thought that was, I don't know, I thought it was appropriate to mention that the thing that people were telling me about the way they found their life's work, that it surprised them, was the same process that I went through in writing the book. And I think that we see that sort of in these many callings throughout our life. We see these opportunities to learn. Is this going to happen the way that I think it should, the way that I'm planning on it happening,
Mm-hmm.
or is this the way that is this going to happen the way that it's meant to happen, the way that I would think that God intended for it to happen? And there's an interesting tension there where we have some control over the outcome. We can fight that the whole way, and I think we miss out on a lot of the joy and excitement of being a part of that journey, or we can kind of follow the path and trust the outcome. So yeah, I mean, I think that's it was interesting. I set out to write one kind of book and wrote a completely different kind of book, And it's fun to talk about because for me it feels honest. It feels like I didn't have an agenda and I was trying to prove something. This is just what I learned about this subject, and I wanted to share it with people, and hopefully it'll resonate with other people as well.
Great, Jeff. We are definitely glad you wrote this book. If you are watching this and you decide, hey, I need that book, we'll have the link in the post below, and you can just check out the Art of Work book. It's called artofworkbook.com. Is that what
Yep.
it is?
Yep,
We'll
that's
have the
right, Neal.
link down there as well,
Cool.
and it's on Amazon wherever books are sold. And just thanks for sharing with us, Jeff. This topic of calling really fits so well with what we're learning on Jesus Hacks about living that selfless life. So thanks for sharing with us. Thanks for choosing to bless us, and